The last man, Shenmei knitted her brow, clearly disappointed by this. If you say so, I suppose that's that then. She flipped the shawl of her dress back and turned to the foreign emissary watching from behind her. Shall we resume our discussion then, Lady Isla? Shenmei somehow managed to sound condescending despite the respectful term of address. The foreign emissary followed, her head covered by a veil. Both women possessed considerable pride, and each regarded the other with a less than friendly expression as they walked. Maomao was just about to sigh in relief when Shenmei stopped. This apothecary of yours cannot possibly do proper work in this place. Let us bring her back to the stronghold with us. A nasty little curl formed on her rouged lips. This brings us to the present moment. Maomao found herself in a storage space. She was told it was the room the previous apothecary had been using. The room was a bit messy, but there was definitely apothecary equipment lying around. A wicker trunk was crammed full of books. Maomao looked at Suhari. You are half-sisters, different mothers. She wasn't so much asking as confirming. She is the only one who treats me like her older sister. There wasn't much to say except that this helped everything make sense. She had heard Lulan was Shishu's only daughter. Considering how fearsome his wife was, she hardly seemed the type to offer equal treatment to a child she hadn't born herself. It seemed she hardly wanted Suhari to exist. Lady Shenmei despises me. It drives her to these things, Suhari said, rubbing her red, swollen cheek. Maomao had a thought. May I ask you something? What, is it possible that Shisui was your name first? Lulan seemed inordinately fond of the name Shisui. It was a perfectly ordinary name, but it combined the Shi of the Shi clan with the sway of Suhari. It was far too simple as pseudonyms went. Anyway, the more common versions of the name used the character for purple to represent Shi, or perhaps offspring. Lulan had chosen some unique characters, but the name still sounded the same. That's right, Suhari said. However, when Lady Shenmei returned from the rear palace, she could not bear the thought of me. She hated that one of the characters in her name was connected to the clan. First, Shenmei had chased the young Suhari and her mother from the mansion. Then she treated them like servants. Finally, she had even taken Suhari's name, giving it to her own daughter as if it were a simple childhood nickname. It seemed she had done it out of spite. Shishu had 2 daughters. One daughter was raised among all the courtly beauties to be offered as a flower to the emperor. The other daughter was shrouded in darkness, meant to sow discord in the rear palace. Now Maomao understood why the assassins had tried to kill Jinshi. This was if they worked for Shishu. Even Maomao had often heard about the strong disagreement between the 2 men regarding how to manage the rear palace, but something still bothered Maomao. She removed the hair stick from her hair and examined it. Shisui, or rather Lulan, had said it was quite valuable. However, someone could afford to give it away without a second thought. This person held considerable influence even beyond the rear palace, despite being young. His name was Jinshi. The man was more than just a eunuch. He wasn't even a eunuch, actually. Maomao stared at the hair stick, then she stopped thinking. What is it? Suhari asked, watching her. When you entered the rear palace as a eunuch, how did they examine you? Bit of an abrupt question, isn't it? Suhari said, looking at the ground. She almost seemed embarrassed. Then she said, it is a physical exam. They feel you right over your undergarments. You do not even have to take anything off. That is how Suhari had been able to get in. She had never had what they were looking for. It probably never occurred to them that a woman might sneak in disguised as a eunuch. It was easier than getting a man past the same hurdle. Is there a chance an uncastrated man could do it? 3 officials check you, each from a different department. It would be tough to bribe everyone. If any one of the 3 did not take the bribe, the others could expect worse than a little beating when it came out that they had let a man into the rear palace. Too much risk for a little pocket change. You would never get all of them to go along with it. So then, how had Jinshi gotten in? Only a few men could come and go in the rear palace as they pleased. Those men were the emperor and his immediate relatives. No, the ages do not match. However, she had often thought that Jinshi was younger than he appeared. He wasn't a child, not exactly, but he gave a distinctly youthful impression. She suspected few other women in the rear palace would agree with her. Maomao did not say anything for a long moment. What are you thinking? Suhari asked. Oh, nothing. All right, better set that aside for now. Come to think of it, she felt like Jinchi had been trying to have some kind of important conversation with her when they had been on that hunt. Might it have had something to do with this subject? If she hadn't noticed, it was his fault for having such superb ox bezoars around. Ox bezoars made people insane, fearsome things indeed. But anyway, she had to think about the situation she was in now. They had travelled about a half day by carriage from the hot springs village. Judging by the sun's position as she could see it through the curtain, they had travelled north. During the journey the landscape turned white, and snow began to fall. Maomao thought they were either far to the north or high in the mountains. Shenmei had spoken of a stronghold. And truly this place had high walls surrounding it and a cliff at its back. It was more a stronghold than a castle. That woman who looked so courtly in a stronghold, she did not seem like someone who would set foot in such a place. Perhaps that was just Maomao's own bias. She knew from experience how tough and stubborn noblewomen could be, but this seemed like it was a bit much. It was almost as if Shenmei saw herself as being at war. Wait a moment. Maomao thought of the Fafer she had seen in the storehouse. She considered how unusual it was for a foreign emissary like the woman called Isla to be in a place like this. So that is what is going on. There had been rumours for some time that the emissaries had been in secret talks with someone. What if it had been the Shi clan? What if that is how the brand new Fafer had arrived? And what if the gun had been disassembled in order to understand it so that more could be produced? Are you planning to start a war? Suhari, who had been about to leave the room, stopped. It is not my decision to make. Considering what Lady Lulan said, I suggest you get started on the medicine. Oh, you do not have to ask me twice. You do not have to ask me at all. Good, there will be food. There is a toilet in the next room down the hall if you need it. And whatever you do, do not make Lady Shenmei mad. Yes, whatever I do. Maomao did not know what kind of discipline would await her if she failed to heed this advice, but Suhari left the room without a backward glance. All right, what to do now? Maomao looked around the room and thought. The entrance was locked. There were bars on the windows and the ground outside was piled with pure white snow. Suhari hadn't bothered to tell her not to try running away. Was that because escape was impossible? Was that her way of saying if you are going to do something, do it right? She opened the door and found a narrow hallway. The restroom was at the far end. Facilities like this were normally located outside or at least on the first floor, but she was on the third floor here. It could not be easy to keep the thing clean, but they seemed less concerned with convenience than with preventing any opportunity for escape. They said there was another apothecary here before me. Had he been confined as well? They said he had died while trying one of his own concoctions. It almost made sense, and then it didn't. Maomao crossed her arms and decided to let the subject lie for the time being. There were more important things to do. Yes, things like this. Maomao began to smile as she approached the packed wicker trunk and opened the lid. The room was completely full of books. She was also curious about the medicine cabinet on the wall, but she could look at that later. She exclaimed, almost without realizing it. To her, the wicker trunk seemed like a treasure chest. She began searching through the contents, cackling like a madwoman. Suhari always brought her meals. These meals consisted of soup and a side vegetable. They were not bad, even if they tended to be a little cold. There were a lot of dried ingredients. They could almost have qualified as field rations. Maomao sat on her bed with her legs crossed. She had looked through all the books in the room. She thought it had taken about 5 days, although it was hard to be sure. It wasn't exactly good manners to rest her chin on her hands and her elbows in front of her, but there was no one here to scold her. There was a war. What a thing to stumble on. Maomao glanced out the window for a moment. Everything was white outside. She suspected the harvest was over, and they were approaching the time of year when there would be no farming to do. She thought she had heard it said once that war was something that happened when the farmers had too much free time. From what she could see through the window, they appeared to be on very high ground. A mountain was at their backs. This was not a bad location for a stronghold. She sketched a map on the tabletop with her finger. If they were in the northern lands, Shihokushu, then this stronghold must have been located right on the country's border. Maomao tossed herself back on the bed, grabbing her hair. She tried to picture a half-circle north of the capital. It would take 10 days by boat. Then she would walk to the hot springs village, and then another half-day by carriage. Were there any mountains in that range? If she had known things were going to turn out like this, she would have studied. She seemed to recall that the exam for court ladies had included some questions about geography. However, each time she opened the book to study, she ended up falling asleep. She hardly remembered any of it. She did remember Jinchi's lady-in-waiting, Sugan, jabbing her awake. I even missed the jabbing now. Just then, Maomao heard raised voices coming from the hallway. She recognized one of them. Curious, she hopped off the bed and put her ear to the door. "Young master, you mustn't play there. Or why not? I haven't explored over here yet." It was Kairu Yu. They must have brought him here along with Maomao. She remembered Sugari frowning at the idea. She could hear other children behind him. "Wait, there are other kids here. What are you doing? You will miss out on your snack. Whatever. Hey, save some for me." Maomao, rocked by the realization that there were children in the stronghold, slid down against the wall and let out a long breath. This place was built like a fortress, but it was obvious what would happen during a siege. As far as Maomao knew, the current emperor was a relatively merciful ruler. However, there were still lines that should not be crossed. One palace woman who tried to kill a high consort was sentenced to hang, and her family was mutilated. Some such measures were unavoidable if the emperor was to maintain his authority. Just imagine what would happen if a rebellion on this scale were to be discovered. No member of the clan would be left alive. Not even the children and infants. Was that why the children were here? Had someone who understood the stakes brought them? Maomao sighed again. She hugged her knees to her chest and rested her chin on them. She should just forget about everyone else. She did not have time to be thinking about things like this, and yet her heart was unbearably, inescapably heavy. Chapter 16. Lahan. Sometime after noon, a diminutive, fox-eyed man showed up at Jinchi's office. Lahan, Gaeshun and Basin were at the office along with Jinchi, and they were dealing with an even larger mass of paperwork than usual. "So that's what's happened," Jinchi said. "It's only a guess, but yes, that's what I think." Lahan was a remarkable man. It appeared to be a La family trait to be eccentric, yet extraordinarily good at one particular thing. By closely analyzing the movement of goods and metal, he discovered the Shi clan was planning something. Lahan indicated a point on a map. It was a disused stronghold. For anyone, even a family whose loyal service stretched back to the days of Wang Mu, to rebuild an abandoned fortress for their own use was considered an act of treason. Jinchi wanted to clutch his head in his hands, but he refrained, in deference to the father and son already present, who both had profound furrows in their brows. Just as he was telling himself he had to focus on what to do, the doorbell jingled. He could hear footsteps approaching. Then the door was thrown open. "Might I ask what you are doing in here?" The question came from none other than the monocled strategist. "Our father." Lahan, who had looked so confident until a moment before, frowned. He folded up the map on the desk and pursed his lips. "Lahan, you cannot just go barging into the offices of noblemen. People will get the wrong idea." "Strange ideas," Lahan said, helping himself to a spot on the office couch. He had brought the couch here himself during one of his previous visits. He had not yet taken it back, so it still sat there. Particularly when no one can tell if the noble you are visiting is a man or a woman, he continued maliciously. Basin stood beside Jinchi. He was about to speak, offering a few words of his own, but Gaeshun held out a hand to stop him. They understood why Lakan was angry. His daughter had been abducted from right under their noses, taken from the rear palace. This man had forced his way into the rear palace to find his girl. The only surprise was that it had taken him this long to come to Jinchi. Very well, Jinchi would submit to his slings and arrows. That was his responsibility. However, he doubted Lakan had come here simply to abuse him. Lahan stepped back dejectedly and worked his way behind Gaeshun, so there were things even this young man had trouble coping with. He seemed to be whispering something to Gaeshun. Basin was eyeing him skeptically, clearly wondering who this abacus-wielding interloper was. Gaeshun summoned a messenger. He was doing something that did not seem to interest the strategist. The strategist stretched out on the couch and gave Jinshi a cold stare. I understand what you are saying, Master Strategist. It was my own fecklessness that caused this, Jinshi said. He understood completely. Even though this was the first he was learning about the secret passage, and even though no one had known about it before, it had been used for both kidnapping and escape. The responsibility lay squarely with him. Truer words were never spoken, Lacan said. What I want now is for you to rescue my daughter immediately. Ah, how simple things would have been if only he were capable of that. At this moment, Jinshi was clearly Lacan's enemy, and everyone at court knew you didn't want to make Lacan your enemy. Even the strategist must have realized that open feuding with Jinshi at this point would serve no one. He had another foe, not Jinshi, but Shishu. Jinshi thought about what had brought the strategist to his office. The man before him wasn't interested in apprehending the culprits of a would-be rebellion against the throne. His priority was to rescue his dear, sweet daughter. Jinshi could not quite understand what the man was thinking. However, he had clearly decided that coming to Jinshi was the quickest way to get what he wanted. A lower official entered with tea. When he saw the people present and noticed the tension between them, he quickly set the drinks down and left. Nobody touched the steaming tea, and it gradually went cold. They wished their heads could cool off as easily, but it was not to be. You do a sorry job in your current state. Do you think things are just going to work out for you like that? Jinshi understood exactly what Lacan thought was sorry about him. He realized the strategist could see through him. He understood Jinshi had created this position for himself in order to escape. Jinshi lacked confidence in what was supposed to be his true place. The eye behind the monocle narrowed. Lacan might have been hoping to feel a little better by cornering Jinshi in his office. Basin looked ready to launch himself at Lacan, but Gaeshun held him back. Lacan watched, looking distinctly uncomfortable. Other sounds seemed to fade away. Jinshi heard clearly only the strategist's words. What more do you think you can do, appearing as a half-man? His voice was ruthless and cruel. There was a long moment and Jinshi was unsure how to respond. Finally he opened his mouth, but another, calmer voice spoke before he could. My apologies. I did not realize you felt so negatively about us. They saw an old man, bent with age, standing in the entryway. Several eunuchs stood behind him, breathing hard. They had carried him in a palanquin, and it was clear they had run to get there quickly. The old man, Liumen, nodded to them, then entered the office, dragging one leg. He said, it was not, of course, my personal preference to become a eunuch. Lacan waved his hands in a mild panic toward the huddled old man. Honored uncle, I meant nothing of the sort. I wasn't talking about you. No, and yet here I am, a sorry half-man. I can't even walk properly. I'm reduced to riding around in a palanquin like a prince. In any case, am I not also culpable for my failure to have kept a proper eye on Maomao? His aspect was almost grandmotherly. His mild gaze was upon the fox strategist. The military man with his monocle was so cowed he looked almost ridiculous. Phew, just in time. Lahan mumbled from behind them. He whispered to Gaeshun, suggesting he summon Liumen. Lacan, Lahan and Liumen together made quite a spectacle. Lacan, who had been imperious just a moment before, now acted like a young boy trying to soothe his distraught mother. Jinshi almost laughed out loud, but he restrained himself with an effort. He glanced behind him and saw Gaeshun with deep furrows on his brow. Gaeshun was probably also restraining laughter. Basin seemed oblivious to what was going on. A question mark almost floated over his head as he listened to the exchange between uncle and nephew. You always tend to get aggressive when you are angry, but you must think of who you are dealing with when you act. I understand that, honored uncle. I knew that much already. I was just responding to what I was told. I did not come here planning to go this far. Jinshi had hardly said anything to Lacan, but he decided to remain quiet about that for now. It was the politic thing to do. I should hope not. Perhaps you could tell him what really brought you here then, politely. Liumen patted Lacan on the shoulder. Silently, Lacan turned toward Jinshi. Then he got up, knelt before Jinshi, and pressed his fist into his palm as a gesture of respect. I come in supplication. I humbly request that you mobilize the army to strike against the rebel, Shishu. Lakan was a grand commandant, in other words, a secretary of military affairs. Jinchi understood what it meant for such a person to ask for the army to be mobilized. Lakan added, the Shi clan appears to have been manufacturing Fafer of the newest kind for years. We have more than enough evidence of their treachery. He spread the materials he had shown Jinchi earlier on the desk once again. That was not even to mention the attempted assassination of Jinchi or Lulan's flight from the rear palace. Corruption ought to be rooted out and destroyed as quickly as possible, said Liumen, even though he winced as he spoke. The kind-hearted doctor was deeply affected by the thought of war, even against rebels. He also knew what it meant for Lakan to make this request of Jinchi. This explained why the strategist had upbraided him, calling him a half-man. If the government moved against the Shi clan, it would mean deploying the Forbidden Army. This force was commanded directly by the emperor,